Hey guys, this is Smithy. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to do yet another dupe video, and this is the newest palette of Natasha Denona, and this is the Natasha Denona's pastel palette. I'm glad that this is a midi palette. So if you guys are like a pastel lover, I think you're going to absolutely enjoy it. I'm not big on pastels, so I'm going to skip for this time, but I really wanted to dupe these shades for you if you are also not like a big on pastel lover, but you are loving the look of the palette. I'm here to help you out. So I am basically going to dupe this palette mainly using two palettes. Some of these shades would be scattered here and there, but I would say 9 out of the 15 shades are duped by using these two palettes, and this is Huda Beauty's Mercury Retrograde palette and Glamlight's Dirty Martini palette. So if you guys are ready, let's begin. So let's first take a look at the palette, and the brand description says travel beyond traditional pastel colors with Natasha's fantastic selection of wonderfully creamy spring shades, from playful pinks and yellows to delicate purples and blues. The pastel palette is bursting with lush, inspiring colors. So as you can see, the palette has 15 beautiful pastel shades, leaning more towards pinks, I would say, but there's definitely a little bit of like greens and blues sprinkled here and there. I actually created this eye look using the dupes that were there in my collection. So if you are interested in this eye look, it would be towards the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. Now, because this palette is a midi palette, it retails at $65 and it has several different finishes. It has 4 cream to powder finishes, 5 duochrome shades, 4 creamy matte finishes, and 2 metallic finishes. Now, out of these 15 shades, 2 of them are the existing shades in the Natasha Denona's line. So if you do have like the Tropic palette from Natasha Denona, which I believe that it is discontinued right now, 2 of the shades, which is called Mint Frost and Limoncello, is already available in that palette. So just keep that in mind. Now, how can I dupe the palette without having the palette with me? I actually watched several of the pastel palette, and I was actually waiting for a person to review it on the YouTube channel so that I can like see the live swatches too. So I would link Jenna Frost's video in the description box below for you guys. She is the one who actually got the palette and reviewed it on her channel. So out of the shades that I could see on the Trend Moods Instagram page as well as Jennifer's YouTube channel, that's how I duplicated all these shades. I think even if it is like not exact dupes, I feel that we are very, very close. Now also, one more disclaimer to put across: if you are aware of like the duochromes and the multichromes in like Divina, Shine by SD, all those indie brands, I don't think you are going to get the same quality in this palette, because the way Jenna like was swatching all these shades, it felt that it is very lackluster. She definitely mentioned that the shift is like very, very slight. So you have to be like very close to notice it. So if you are like interested in this palette because of the duochromes and the multichromes, I have better options for you guys for sure. I actually, when I was duping this palette, I intentionally had to go with like lesser pigmented shades and like less shift on duochrome so that I can duplicate that palette. But yes, I would still say if I'm seeing all the swatches that people are doing and Jenna was doing on her YouTube channel, I would say my shades are definitely much more pigmented. So definitely go with a very light hand, but all of them are superb quality. So no doubts on that. So let's begin duping the palette. So the first shade in the palette is called Tulle, which is more of a cream to powder finish. And this is being duped by the shade which is called Off Balance from the Mercury Retrograde palette from Huda Beauty. And this is like a very muted, a mid-tone pastel pink, I would say, in the matte finish. So I think that this is absolutely stunning to have in the palette. But because it's a cream to powder, the formula would not be same. I would not like duplicate the formula. So keep that in mind. I'm only duplicating the shades. Let me swatch that for you, Off Balance. And I'll give you the close-up towards the end of the video all together. I'm going to do row by row on the back of my hand so that you can see the shades more closely. So that would be the first shade, which is called Tulle from the palette, which is being duped by Off Balance. Now the second shade in the palette is called Illusion. So this, Jenna said that this is like the most shifting shade of the palette. It appears to be a white shadow, but when it is swatched, it has like that silver to pink shift. So as soon as I actually saw the shade, as well as when she like swatched the shade, I exactly knew that this shade is going to be very, very close to this. And this is from the ABH Subculture palette, and the shade name is called Cube. Now this is also a beautiful duochrome. It appears to be like white in the palette, but when you swatch this, now this is the shade called Cube. Now you can see that white coming through, but I don't know if you can see that pink shift or not. I clearly can see. Okay, you can see. Like that is like a silver to pink shift. And that I would say is exactly the same shade called Illusion from that palette. Such a beautiful shade. Like, yeah, for sure. And you can definitely use this more like a topper shade, or because it has that like white base, it completely justifies to be in like the pastel palette. Love it. Now the third shade in the palette is called Mint Frost, which is being duped by the shade called On the Rocks from the Glam Light Dirty Martini palette. Now this is an existing shade in the palette, as I said. This is more of like a shimmery silvery mint shade, but such a beautiful shade. In the Natasha's palette, this is definitely a standout shade in the palette, I would say. And even in the Dirty Martini palette, I love this shade. Like I love this shade. Such a beautiful shimmer and gives so much more like dimension on the eyes. Absolutely fantastic. And if I have not told you, this is more on the metallic shade, even in Natasha Denona's palette. Now let's move on to the fourth shade in that row, and this is called Bora from the palette, and this is being duped by the shade called Hot Mess from the Mercury Retrograde palette. Now in the Natasha Denona's palette, this is more of a cream to powder formula, but this is like a creamy matte formula in the Huda palette. So let's swatch it. You can see how pigmented these shades are. It's just beautiful. And definitely because it's like a cream to powder finish in Natasha's palette, this would be the deepest shade in that palette. Now the next shade in the palette is called Dainty, which is more of the duochrome shimmer shade. This I think is like a new formula in the Natasha Denona's line altogether, because it's mentioned as DCS. Duochromes are like a new thing for her. So this is more mentioned like a duochrome shimmer. And this has been duped by the shade which is called Cosmic from the Huda Beauty's Mercury Retrograde palette. Now this is definitely like a pink and a silver shimmer, and such a beautiful shimmer from the palette. Love it. Like absolutely stunning, I would say. Let me swatch that for you. Stunning it is. Absolutely stunning. Like look at that shine. Beautiful. So that is like the first row of the palette duped. Next shade in the palette is called Brisk, which is being duped by the shade called Haze from the Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette. Now, I personally feel that this one has definitely a little more depth to it, whereas the one that is in the Natasha Denona's palette, it's a little more on the brighter and like a muted side, I would say. I love this shade. Like, look at that. Stunning it is. Love, love, absolutely love it. And the shade Brisk in Natasha Denona's website is also a creamy matte formula. So yeah, I would say even the formula would be like pretty similar. So the next shade in the palette is called Adriatic, and this is a duochrome shade in her palette, and this is being duped by the shade called Gin. Now this in the Glam Light palette is more of like a green to a blue shifting shade. Superb, but I definitely feel that the shade Gin is much more pigmented than the ones that was there in the palette, which is called Adriatic. And that is, oh my God, that's stunning. So that is the shade Adriatic being duped by the shade called Gin. Now the next shade in the palette is called Starlet. Now, I am going to mention two shades for you guys. If you do not have this main shade, you can still dupe it with the Glam Light palette. But I would say the closest dupe to that shade, I would say, is Macaroon from JD Glow eyeshadow. Like you can see clearly that red and like that copper shift coming through. And I think this is like an exact dupe to that shade. But let's say if you do not have that JD Glow shadow, I would say this would come very, very close to it. But this has a little bit more of like that green shift to it also. So this is more of that red shade, but it has that green shift. Can you see that? Yeah, let me just swatch both of it for you guys, but I'm gonna say like macaroon would be the closest. So I'm gonna swatch macaroon for the shade. Like, look at that. I mean, I am pretty sure like those shades will not pop like this because these are like pigmented shades. So you have to like apply with a tiny little bit of pressure if you want to dupe Natasha Denona's palette. But I would say shade wise, we're very, very close. So let me swatch both those shades so that you can see that difference. This is from the Glam Light palette and this is Macaroon from JD Glow. So you can see that green shift coming through from the Glam Light palette, but it has that copper shift and that red base to it. And this is Macaroon from JD Glow. So that's the difference. I love both of these shades equally. Now for the next few shades, we're going to dip into our Blueberry Muffin palette. So the next shade in the palette is called Bellini, which is like a pastel orange shade, a very muted orange shade, I would say. And this has been duped by the shade called Fluffy from the palette. I don't know if you can see that pastel or not, just because the background is like so holographic, but it is exactly the same shade. And this is Fluffy, which dupes the shade Bellini from the palette. Like, look at that. Even Huda Beauty's Mercury Retrograde also has a very similar shade, I would say, but in the Huda Beauty's palette, it's much more punchy. I'll show it to you. Can you achieve a similar look on the eyes? For sure you can. And in the Huda Beauty palette, this is the shade that I'm talking about. It's called Utopia. So let me swatch actually both these shades so that you can see the difference. Definitely Fluffy is more like pastel-y. So this is Fluffy. And this is Utopia. So you can see like this is definitely like a 2 shades more punchy, I would say, but this is much more pastel-y. Now the next shade in the palette is called Bubble, which is more of a cream to powder finish. So definitely I'm not duping the formula. Mine is more of like a powdery matte, and this is duped by the shade called Delish from the Blueberry Muffin palette. Now you can see it's a very muted pastel blue. Again, because of the background, it'll be very difficult for you guys to see, but it is like a very muted periwinkle blue, I would say. So let me swatch that for you. And that is the shade Bubble duped by the shade called Delish from the Blueberry Muffin palette. So that is the second row swatched for you guys. Okay, now let's move on to the last row. Now the first shade in the palette is called Limoncello, and this is a beautiful yellow shimmer, but very like a muted yellow shimmer, I would say. As soon as I saw that shade, it totally reminded me of one of the shades in the Natasha Denona's face palette, and this is like her highlighting shade, and this is the shade that I'm talking about. Like, this exactly looks like that shade. Not even kidding. But this is more of like a cream to powder finish, and the Limoncello shade in her palette is more of a metallic finish. So let me swatch that for you guys. Like, just stunning. Can you see that? This as like a highlighter is stunning. I mean, this isn't highlighter, but as like an inner corner or a highlighter, it just blends into the skin so beautifully. So you can definitely sheer it out too, just for your information. Now the next shade in the palette is called Duet, and this is a beautiful duochrome of like a pink to a purple shift, and this I have duped by the shade called Sin from JD Glow. Now I know that Natasha Denona's shade Duet does not have like a major shift. That's why I chose this shade, because this doesn't have like a major shift, but this is very sparkly and I don't think Duet is that sparkly. So that would be the difference, but otherwise the shade wise, I think we are very close. So you can see that pink and that purple coming through. It's a beautiful shade, like one of my favorite shades from JD Glow. Stunning. I actually thought of like duping it with this purple shade, but this is definitely like a lot more purplier in tone. And then I thought of like mixing this and this, but it will still show a little more on the deeper side. So that's why I wanted to choose Sin instead of using this palette again. Now the next shade in the palette is called Airy. Now this is a beautiful powdered blue shade. Now, because I do not have a lot of blue in my collection, I only had like one powder blue shade in like a matte formula, and this is from the Hummingbird palette, and this is from Odin's Eye, and the shade that I'm duping it is called Clear Blue from the palette. This definitely is that shade, but I could not dupe it from the Huda Beauty or from the Glam Light palette. So let me swatch that for you guys. See how beautiful that shade is? I mean, lovely. Like, I love it. So, so pretty. Now, the next shade in the palette is called Zest. And this is a beautiful, like a punchy olive green shade. And I have duped that with this shade, which is called Green Olive from the Glam Light Dirty Martini palette. Now, I would say definitely the shade from the Natasha Denona's palette is much more lighter. This is definitely 2 shades deeper than that, but the tone is very, very similar. But if you do have Red Dragon palette from Odin's Eye, the shade that is called Jade, I think it would be a lot more similar to the other shade, but again, this is much more muted, but the shade which is called Zest is very, very punchy. So for that reason, I'm going to mix both of these together. Let's first start off by putting Green Olive as a shade, but I'm going to like dip like only once so that I don't get that much punchiness. But if you have like a matte yellow shade, I think that would be great to mix in with this shade. So I'm going to mix Jade also, just so that I can get that lightness out of it. And this is Jade mixed with that shade. So that would be a dupe for Zest from the Natasha's palette. Again, not like an exact dupe for sure, but a little closer. Now the last shade in the palette is called Feather, and this is being duped by the shade called Libra from the Huda Beauty palette. Now this shade in the Natasha's palette is a creamy matte formula, and so is this in the Huda palette. So let me swatch that. It's a beautiful, like a cool tone pinky purple, I would say. And this is the shade Libra from the Huda palette. And that's how the last row looks. So now let me show you a close-up of all the swatches together in the outside lighting, so that you can see all in its like full potential and full glory. And now I would show you a swatch comparison of the Natasha's palette swatch and my hand swatches. And you can decide for yourself whether I did close to it, whether I did good or good enough for you guys to not to buy and not to invest in a $65 palette. But if you are like interested in that palette and you would use pastels, I would say just go for it. But if you're looking for like punchy duochromes and very pigmented mattes, I don't think this palette is for you, just because out of the reviews that I saw, I don't think it's like very punchy or very pigmented. But if you are like ready to build those shades, I think you'll enjoy it. So that's how I duped the Natasha Denona's pastel palette with the shades that I already had in my collection. Now, if you want to see how I achieved this eye look, then please keep on watching. So that's my final eye look for you guys. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did like it, please do give it a thumbs up and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and ring the notification bell so that you're notified every time that I post next. I generally upload 3 videos every single week, every Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Until next time, I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye guys.